There is a version of you that exists in the quiet hours, the one who shows up after everyone else has gone to sleep and the noise of the day finally stops. That version of you carries something the daytime version doesn't have room for. A question, maybe. A memory that refuses to settle. A feeling that keeps returning, even though you have never quite found the right words to describe it. Something remains unfinished inside you, not necessarily because something dramatic happened, but because something meaningful was never fully understood. If you're listening to this right now, some part of you may already recognize what I'm describing. Maybe it happens when you're driving, working, scrolling through your phone, or lying awake at night. Everything around you is completely ordinary, yet suddenly, without warning, your mind brings that person back into focus. Maybe it's their name appearing in your thoughts for no obvious reason, right in the middle of something completely unrelated. You weren't looking for them. You weren't talking about them. You weren't even consciously thinking about the past. You were simply moving through an ordinary moment, focused on whatever was in front of you, and then suddenly their presence appears in your mind as though someone quietly opened a door you had forgotten was there. For a few seconds, everything else seems to become secondary. You might wonder where the thought came from, why it appeared now, and why this particular person still has the ability to occupy space in your mind when you weren't deliberately giving them any. Sometimes the thought is gentle, almost comforting. Other times it arrives with a strange heaviness, bringing memories and emotions you thought you had already put away. And the most confusing part is that there may be no obvious trigger. Nothing happened. You didn't see their photograph. You didn't hear their name. Nobody mentioned them. Yet somehow, your mind found its way back to them. This can happen because memory isn't organized purely by logic. Emotional experiences become connected to countless details that we may not consciously recognize. A particular time of day, a familiar smell, a melody playing somewhere in the background, a certain phrase, or even a feeling you're experiencing in the present can quietly activate an older memory. Sometimes the trigger isn't outside you at all. It can be an emotion. You may feel lonely, hopeful, nostalgic, uncertain, excited, or vulnerable, and your mind searches through its emotional history for something that resembles what you're experiencing now. Suddenly that person comes to mind because they are connected to a period when you felt something similar. And this is why the appearance of their name doesn't necessarily mean you consciously want them back. It may simply mean that your mind still associates them with something emotionally significant. Perhaps they represented safety. Perhaps they represented possibility. Perhaps they represented a version of yourself that you rarely get to experience anymore. Or perhaps the relationship ended before you fully understood what it meant to you. That's why a random thought can sometimes feel much bigger than it actually is. The mind isn't always saying, "Go back." Sometimes it's simply saying, "There is something here you haven't completely understood yet." So when their name suddenly appears in your thoughts, you don't have to panic or immediately assign a meaning to it. You can simply notice it. Let the memory exist for a moment without turning it into a prediction, a sign, or a reason to reopen a door, because sometimes remembering someone isn't about them at all. Sometimes it's about discovering what their presence awakened inside you and understanding why that part of you still deserves to be heard. And yet there they are, occupying a tiny corner of your mind as if some invisible thread has suddenly been pulled. Sometimes it's not even their name. It might be a particular song, a familiar place, a sentence they once said, the way they used to look at you, or even a small detail you thought you had forgotten. Something ordinary becomes a doorway, and suddenly you're standing in an emotional moment you haven't visited in months or even years. And this is where things become interesting, because remembering someone doesn't automatically mean you should return to them. It doesn't necessarily mean they're thinking about you at the exact same moment. And it doesn't prove that the relationship was destined to continue. Sometimes a recurring memory is simply your mind trying to process something that never received a proper emotional conclusion. We often assume that moving on means forgetting. But the human mind doesn't work like a recycling bin, where unwanted memories can simply be emptied and permanently deleted. Experiences that carry strong emotional meaning can remain connected to certain places, sensations, sounds, and patterns long after the conscious mind has decided to move forward. That's why you can feel completely fine for weeks and then suddenly experience a wave of emotion you thought had disappeared. The feeling isn't necessarily evidence that you've gone backward. It may simply be evidence that something inside you is still being integrated. Perhaps what remains isn't even the person themselves. Maybe what remains is the version of you that existed around them, the person you became when you felt understood, the confidence you discovered, the vulnerability you allowed yourself to experience, the future you imagined. Sometimes we miss someone when what we're actually grieving is an entire emotional world that existed while they were part of our lives. And perhaps that's why the memory feels so difficult to name. Because sometimes the heart isn't asking a simple question like, "Do I still love this person?" Sometimes it's asking something much more complicated. Why did this person affect me so deeply? What was I supposed to learn from what happened? Why does a part of me still feel like something is unfinished? And those questions don't always have immediate answers. Maybe that's why the memory keeps returning. Not necessarily because you're supposed to chase it, but because some part of your inner world is still trying to understand what it meant. You're driving, or washing dishes, or half listening to a conversation, and suddenly you're somewhere else entirely, back in a moment you thought you'd already processed. Maybe it shows up as a specific song, or a smell, or a stretch of road you used to drive together, something ordinary that your mind has quietly turned into a doorway. None of that means anything is wrong with you. It means you're a person who felt something real, and real things don't erase themselves just because we'd find it more convenient if they did. I'm not going to tell you that someone specific is thinking about you at this exact moment, because I don't know that, and honestly, no one making a video like this one knows that either. What I do know is something simpler, and I think more useful. I know that if you've ever lain awake replaying a conversation, or felt your chest tighten at a name you weren't expecting to hear, or wondered whether the way you loved someone was too much, too fast, too real, too honest, you are not broken, and you are not alone in that. That experience is so common it's almost universal, and there's a reason it hits as hard as it does. Let's talk about why waiting for someone feels the way it feels. Because it isn't just sadness, is it? It's something stranger than that. It's a kind of suspended animation where part of your mind keeps living in a moment that already ended, replaying it, revising it, trying out different endings like you're still allowed to choose one. The mind does this because it doesn't like unfinished stories. It doesn't like loose threads. A clean ending, even a painful one, is something the brain can eventually file away and move past. But something that just fades, something with no real closure, no real conversation, no real answer to the question of what happened and why, that keeps working on you in the background whether you want it to or not. This is why almost love often hurts more than a clear rejection. If someone tells you plainly that it's over, that hurts, but it hurts in a way you can eventually build a wall around. What's harder is when something felt real, felt mutual, felt like it meant something to both of you, and then quietly stopped without an ending. No fight, no explanation, just distance that crept in and never fully left. That kind of experience doesn't resolve on its own timeline. It resolves on its own terms, usually much later, usually when you're not expecting it, and often only part way. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living inside an unfinished story for too long. You go about your days, you function, you show up for work and for the people around you, and from the outside, nothing looks off. But there's a low hum running underneath all of it, a background process that never fully shuts down, quietly sorting through the same handful of unanswered questions over and over. Why did it end the way it did? What would have happened if one thing had gone differently? Whether the version of events you've settled on is even the true one, or just the version that hurt the least to believe. That hum is tiring in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived inside it, because it doesn't look like distress from the outside. It just looks like you, going about your life, a little more tired than usual, a little more prone to going quiet when your mind wanders somewhere you didn't choose to send it. Here's something worth sitting with. The fact that you still think about this person doesn't mean you did something wrong, and it doesn't mean you're stuck, and it definitely doesn't mean you need someone to walk back through the door in order to be okay. What it usually means is that the connection was real while it lasted, and real things leave an imprint. That's not weakness. That's just how attachment works. You don't get to selectively unfeel something just because it stopped being convenient or stopped being reciprocated. At the same time, I want to be honest with you about something, because false comfort isn't actually comfort. Wondering whether someone is thinking about you, hoping they might come back, replaying old messages at 1 a.m, none of that tells you anything reliable about what's actually happening on their side. Your longing is real. It's valid. It deserves to be taken seriously. But it is not a window into someone else's mind, and it was never designed to be one. The ache you feel is information about you, about what mattered to you, about what you're still working through. It is not proof of anything happening on the other end of that silence. This matters because there's a whole industry built around blurring that line, around telling people that their private longing is secretly a message from the universe, that a stranger's feelings can be read through a screen, that if you just comment the right word or believe hard enough, the person will come back transformed and ready. I think that's worth naming plainly, because if you've ever consumed content like that late at night, when you were at your most raw and most hopeful, I don't think you were foolish for believing it. I think you were exactly the kind of person that content is built to find. Vulnerability isn't a character flaw. It's just a state that's easy to take advantage of. And a lot of things online are built to do exactly that. It's worth noticing how that kind of content usually works, not so you feel foolish for having encountered it, but so you can recognize it faster next time you're in a low moment and it crosses your path again. It tends to describe feelings so broad that almost anyone could recognize themselves in them, a lingering look, a name that won't leave your head, a sense that something was unfinished, and then it presents those universal experiences back to you as though they were specific proof about your exact situation. It borrows credibility from places that sound wise, a Bible verse, a psychologist's name, the word universe repeated until it starts to feel like an authority rather than a metaphor. And almost always, somewhere in the middle of the emotional peak, it asks you to do something small and public, leave a comment, hit a button, type a specific word, not because that action helps you in any way, but because it signals to an algorithm that the content is working, which means more people in exactly your position will be shown the same thing next. None of that is a reflection on you for having been moved by it. It's a reflection on how well built that machinery is at finding people who are hurting and keeping them hooked. So let's set that aside and talk about what's actually true, because there's still something real and hopeful here. It's just not the version with guarantees attached. It's true that people do sometimes come back, sometimes with real growth behind them, sometimes with honest apologies, sometimes ready to build something healthier than what existed before. That happens. It's not a myth. but it happens on its own, unpredictable timeline, shaped by that person's own choices, their own healing, their own life circumstances, none of which you can will into existence from the outside, no matter how much you hope or wait or wish. And here's the harder truth underneath that. Even if they do come back, your healing was never supposed to depend on that outcome in the first place. It's also worth being honest that sometimes people don't come back, and that outcome deserves just as much respect as the other one. Some connections end for reasons that make sense once you have enough distance to see them clearly. Incompatible timing, different needs, growth that simply moved in two different directions. That's not always a tragedy waiting to be reversed. Sometimes it's just an accurate ending. And accepting that doesn't mean you loved any less or that what you had meant any less. It means you're capable of holding something as meaningful and also complete. Two things that are allowed to exist together, even though it can feel like admitting one cancels out the other. That's the part that gets buried under all the noise about soulmates and cosmic timing and love finding its way back. Your worth was never sitting in someone else's hands, waiting for them to notice it, waiting for them to be ready, waiting for the right conditions to align. You were whole before this connection existed. You'll be whole after it, whatever after ends up looking like. The connection mattered. It shaped you. It's allowed to have mattered deeply without being the thing your entire sense of self hinges on. I want to talk for a second about what it actually looks like to sit with longing without letting it run your life, because that's a real skill, and almost nobody teaches it directly. It doesn't mean forcing yourself to stop feeling things. Suppression doesn't work, not really. It just delays the feeling and usually makes it louder later. It means something closer to this. Noticing the feeling when it shows up, letting it be there without immediately building a story on top of it, and then gently returning your attention to your actual life, the one happening right now, in front of you, not the one you're replaying or the one you're imagining might still happen. Practically, that might mean not spending your nights scrolling through old messages looking for hidden meaning in punctuation and timing. It might mean noticing when you're constructing an entire narrative about someone's inner life based on nothing but your own hope. It might mean being honest with yourself about the difference between "I still care about this person" and "this person is definitely thinking about me right now," and working up the courage to come back. The first one is just true, and it's allowed to be true for a long time. The second one is a story, and stories, even comforting ones, aren't the same thing as facts. It can also help to notice the specific moments when the longing tends to spike, because it's rarely random. For a lot of people, it's the transition points in a day, the quiet stretch right before sleep, the first few minutes after waking up before the day's demands take over, a long drive with nothing to distract you. Those are the moments when the mind, no longer occupied with anything urgent, drifts back toward whatever is still unresolved. Knowing that pattern doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it can take some of the power out of it. Instead of the thought arriving and feeling like a sudden, alarming sign that something is wrong, it can start to feel more like weather, a predictable front moving through, something you've learned to expect and can ride out without letting it steer the rest of your day. It's also worth paying attention to what you actually do in those moments, because the instinct to soothe the ache can sometimes deepen it instead. Rereading old conversations, looking at old photos, checking whether someone has posted anything recently. These things can feel like they're helping in the moment, the way scratching an itch feels like relief for about 2 seconds. But they usually just reopen the loop rather than closing it, feeding the part of your mind that's still trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. It's not about never allowing yourself to look back. It's about noticing when looking back has stopped being occasional reflection and started being a habit that keeps the wound from ever fully closing. There's also something worth saying about the version of you that existed during that connection, because a lot of what people actually grieve isn't just the other person. It's who they got to be around them. Maybe you felt more understood. Maybe you felt like you didn't have to perform, or explain yourself constantly, or translate who you are into something smaller and easier to digest. If that's true, it's worth asking yourself honestly, was that feeling actually unique to them, or did they simply happen to be there while you let your guard down for the first time in a while? Because if it's the second one, that capacity was always yours. You didn't lose access to being fully yourself just because one specific person isn't around anymore to witness it. You can build that same openness again with other people, in other contexts, on your own terms. None of this means you have to force yourself to move on by some invented deadline, or pretend you feel neutral about something that clearly still matters to you. Grief doesn't work on a schedule, and love that meant something doesn't just switch off, because it would be more convenient if it did. Give yourself permission to still care. Give yourself permission to still wonder sometimes. That's not the same as being stuck. Being stuck is when the wondering starts running your decisions, when you're organizing your actual life around the possibility of a return that may or may not ever come. Caring, on the other hand, can just sit there quietly in the background while you keep living. If you're in this right now, in the middle of it, still working out what this connection meant and what to do with everything you're feeling, here's what I'd actually offer you. Instead of false certainty about someone else's heart, be honest with yourself about what you can and can't know. You can know how you feel. You can know what you valued about the connection. You can know what you learned about yourself through it, good and hard both. You cannot know with any real certainty what's happening in someone else's private thoughts, no matter how many signs you think you're noticing or how many patterns feel meaningful. That's not pessimism. That's just an honest boundary around what belongs to you and what doesn't. Build your life around the things you can actually influence, your own growth, your own honesty with yourself, your own willingness to stay open to connection in the future, even after being hurt. Those are the things that actually determine how your story goes from here, far more than whether one particular person eventually walks back through the door. If they do, and if it's healthy, and if it's mutual, that can be a genuinely good thing, but it was never supposed to be the only good thing available to you. You are allowed to want to be chosen. You are allowed to hope someone comes back changed and ready for something real. But you don't have to build your peace on top of that hope in the meantime. You can have peace now, imperfect and real, built out of your own steadiness, your own honesty, your own refusal to hand your sense of worth over to someone else's timeline. That kind of peace doesn't depend on predictions coming true. It's just yours, built out of how you choose to live, regardless of what anyone else eventually decides to there. Quote, S a quieter version of hope that I think gets overlooked, because it doesn't come with the drama of a dramatic return or a perfectly timed apology. It's the hope that comes from noticing slowly that you're handling hard things better than you used to, that a memory that once would have derailed your entire day now passes through in a few minutes instead of a few hours, that you laughed at something today without the laugh being interrupted by a stray thought about them. Those small shifts rarely feel like victories in the moment, because healing doesn't usually announce itself. It just quietly changes the terms of your everyday life until one day you notice you've been standing a little steadier for a while without realizing exactly when that started. None of this requires you to pretend the connection didn't matter or to rush yourself into some performance of being completely fine before you actually are. You're allowed to move at whatever pace this actually takes, even if that pace doesn't match what anyone else, including some version of yourself, thinks it should look like. There's no schedule you're falling behind on. There's just where you are right now. And the fact that you're still here, still thinking clearly enough to sit with a message like this one, already says something about your own resilience that's worth acknowledging on its own terms. That quote is really the whole message. Not that someone is secretly thinking about you right now, because I can't tell you that, and neither can anyone else with any honesty, but that whatever you're carrying, whoever you're carrying it for, it doesn't have to define whether you're okay. You get to be okay on your own terms, starting now, whether or not anyone else ever comes back to see it.